More and more nowadays, it feels to me that new games, despite having some of the most impressive visuals and highest production quality possible, aren't as fun as they used to be. Like, playing them doesn't have that same kind of carefree magic that it used to. I'm not saying that new games are all boring and lifeless, but in some regards, it feels like in the pursuit of polishing them to perfection, video games lost their identity as games.
I lost something I couldn't live without. My identity.
Because of the tendency to make streamlined games that appeal to everyone, it feels to me like AAA games are, in fact, trying to be anything other than a video game. A playable movie where occasionally you hit up to progress, a black hole of monetization that exists solely to infinitely suck money from the player, or sometimes even the story of the developer's self-insert that nobody asked for that's dead on arrival and tanks the studio who made it. I personally miss the old days when video games embraced their identity as games, and had this crazy idea where they prioritized making unique gameplay mechanics or trying oddball, goofy ideas over worrying about having the most groundbreaking graphics or story, when they didn't need to include a battle pass to maximize profits or a heavy-handed message to philosophically question the player. Sometimes I just need to know that the turtle is bad and I gotta save the princess for the 36th time. I miss the simpler times when a game could simply exist to be a fun experience for the player. Games nowadays are becoming increasingly complex big-budget productions with loads of features and stunning realistic graphics, and while all of that can be a plus in some regards, these trends can also lead to them feeling a bit much. To put it simply, overproduced. Sometimes I long for the days of more simple game design. Sometimes I just want to kick back and do a kick flip as Spider-Man in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. I admire that apparent golden age for video games and wanted to reminisce about that and compare it to how games are designed now. So as such, this video will be split into roughly two parts. The first part is the bulk of the essay where I run down my grievances with the current trends of how AAA games are made, and the second is a look back at the merits of more simple game design, and ultimately, one of the biggest issues I think with games nowadays is the massive amount of bloat that comes along with them. When I talk about bloat, I'm mostly referring to many features, content, and other aspects of game design that developers prioritize or tack onto games nowadays that don't really add much to the core gameplay experience of the game. These typically act as either padding to make the game seem bigger or higher quality, or to make the player keep spending money on additional content. To illustrate what I mean, let me run you through a hypothetical situation. You get a game and hit the download button, and are met with a download the size of the state of Texas. Once that's finally done, it opens a third-party launcher, forcing you to make an account there, only to hit you with another series of patches. Don't forget the always online DRM. After that, more often than not, you have to navigate past the online storefronts to get to the game where there's 20 minutes worth of intro cutscenes followed by a lengthy and hand-holdy tutorial segment to make sure that even games journalists can beat it.
Only problem is that during SpongeBob's wind-up animation for bowling, he walks forward. That means you fall off of the button, which closes the gate and prevents you from bowling the bubble where you intended.
It feels like just getting to the point of being able to play a game that you bought requires jumping through hoops. Not a huge deal, sure, but certainly annoying. Contrast this with something like Mario 64. You pop this bad boy in, hit start, Peach tells you about her cake, Mario jumps out of a pipe, and away you go to jump around the courtyard. No 10-minute cutscene explaining the backstory of Mario's dead daughter, no prompts telling you to go to the marked area on the map and press F to pay respects. Just a simple enough setup where you can learn the mechanics of the game simply by playing the game. It seems like companies making these kinds of simple single-player experiences have declined in favor of more competitive online games or games with forced online integration. And to that end, a lot of companies try and squeeze the most longevity and money out of their games by adding a ton of live service features. Battle passes, RNG cosmetics, seasonal updates, many of these features exist to hook the player and keep them coming back. Companies don't want to make a fun experience that you can enjoy for a playthrough or two anymore. If it doesn't continuously make you money, it's not worth the investment to some of these companies. For a funny recent example, an EA CEO said that the new Dragon Age game failed commercially because it doesn't have live service features. He went on to suggest that people just don't enjoy single-player games anymore.
You serious?
These kind of out-of-touch statements made about the people in charge of the studios making new games is a frightening concept. While these features can continuously breathe new life into a game, it shouldn't be what every game strives to focus on. Another area of games that's especially guilty of padding out their games with lots of filler and bloat are most open-world games. There's a misconception, I think, when it comes to how we determine the quality of a game. Many developers seem to think that longer playtimes equate to a better game, but I would argue that more doesn't always mean better. Oftentimes, these games talk about how vast their maps are and how many hours of content there is. Not always, but these tend to be endless checklists of boring things to do, and the maps tend to be very shallow in design. Sure, you have a massive map, but it's not interesting enough to make me want to explore all 200 procedurally generated dungeons collecting cheese wheels or climbing towers or whatever. I don't care to spend 100 hours doing the same kind of copy and pasted missions over and over again. Having a vast array of content and a ton of stuff to do isn't bad on its own, but oftentimes it makes the game lack focus and takes away from the core gameplay. All of this fluff makes me not want to even finish a game in some cases. Almost always, I'll choose a shorter game with tighter design over these massive productions with little to no substance in them. And I do mean massive. Games nowadays have a file size typically between 80 to 150 gigabytes for a modern AAA game, which makes sense. It's not 1999 anymore, and we're not trying to fit a whole game on a 64 megabyte cartridge to ship out. But why are the sizes of games so meaty nowadays? I can hear you, the beautiful viewer, asking. Well, that leads to my next point. Great segue, right? Adding to the aforementioned bloat is the next big issue in my opinion with how games are developed, which is the focus on graphics, cutscenes, and narrative. A lot of new games nowadays are described as cinematic experiences, and as such, studios prioritize having photorealistic graphics and hiring tons of actors to motion capture their movements and speech for each cutscene in order to tell whatever kind of story the game is telling. Studios are more than willing to spend the big dollars to make their games look as breathtaking and lifelike as possible, and it certainly shows. My go-to example is The Last of Us 2. That game looks fantastic. The world that they've made is really cool to look at, and the level of detail on every little thing in it is honestly nuts. The way the snow scatters as you move around, the reflections in the water, and the lighting all just scream top quality. However, that comes at a cost. The game took almost 6 years and approximately $1 more billion, or in Freedom currency about $220 million, to develop, making it one of the most expensive games to ever produce. With the rat race to try and make every new game that comes out a groundbreaking technical and cinematic masterpiece, this trend only seems to be getting worse. Games taking longer and longer to make and becoming more expensive also means that we as the consumer will sometimes have to wait long stretches of time to see a new entry for our favorite series. With the average price of a new game steadily rising, with some costing as much as $90+, these are steep investments for both the player and the developer. If the game flops, that could mean the death of the studio and you wasting your hard-earned money on a half-baked turd of a video game. In some cases, this is all completely unnecessary. I personally am a firm believer that having a good art style or art direction will make a game so much more timeless than constantly striving for hyper-realism in graphics. It's the reason something like Wind Waker ages more gracefully than other games around its time which strive for a more realistic art style. Games like Jet Set Radio, Okami, Beautiful Joe, all of these lean into a highly stylized art style, which is why they're so easily remembered as opposed to whichever battlefield they were on that year. For a slightly closer comparison, the original Dead Space still holds up fairly well today visually. They achieved beautifully looking graphics via the clever use of lighting and other tricks, so while not as technically impressive, it still looks great. Some of my favorite games in recent years leaned entirely into looking like a retro video game, which just shows that you can make a game that has some amazing and memorable visuals without it having to be the most technically impressive. Not to mention, all of this focus on the way the game looks tends to lessen the focus on how the game feels to play. Generally, these games have a high concentration of cutscenes compared to gameplay, to the point where the game is more of a playable movie, which I think most of Sony's first-party games are guilty of falling into. These oftentimes break the pacing of the game in order to lazily dump story beats with small segments of gameplay between them. Not to say that these can't also be good games, but it feels like the gameplay is being sidelined in favor of better graphics and narrative. And while I think those are absolutely important, I don't think they should take precedence over making a fun gameplay experience. Some games suffer from trying so hard to deliver a complex story or thought-provoking message that they sideline the gameplay to fit those narratives. I want to like some of these games because they have interesting worlds or lore, but I can't be fucked to actually want to play them, which just brings them down in my opinion. Because it's easy to pick on, we're going back to Last of Us 2. It's clear they wanted to tell a story rather than make a fun game to play, which would be fine if the story wasn't microwave dog turds on a plate. Games are an interactive medium, and taking away that player agency in order to bombard them with scripted event after scripted event in order to tell your shitty story almost takes away the biggest part of the medium of video games, the interactive part. Revenge is bad, the game isn't very clever or subtle about it, but I get it, and while I can respect what they were going for, I would also respect it if they at least gave me the option to bludgeon certain characters to death with a brick. Jokes aside, there's ways to make your story more impactful or engaging outside of just throwing a ton of cutscenes at the player. It's like why games such as Baldur's Gate or Cyberpunk, which are also cinematic and story heavy, aren't so harshly critiqued because story aside, the gameplay is still fun. While I firmly believe that video games are an art, there's no question about it, it's a form of art that you can interact with and experience in your own way. Sure, the developers give us the base of it, but what we do with it or take from it is really what elevates a video game story as an art form. It's why video essay YouTubers are still talking about Ocarina of Time 20 years later. I'm all for good storytelling in games, but it shouldn't take away from other aspects of the game design, and I find that the best games find a way to weave the story into the gameplay and strike a balance that brings out the best of both aspects. Something like Dark Souls or Hollow Knight, where the gameplay being notoriously difficult makes sense, as oftentimes you're just a small dude wandering through this overbearingly defeated world, fighting against gods with a stick. Mind you, most of this is told in the background for the player to figure out themselves. Or Undertale, depending on your actions towards the enemies, it can drastically affect how the story and world play out before you. These games do more for their stories and world building through the gameplay than most games do through their 20-minute cutscenes full of dialogue. It's why I think games that take a more subtle approach to storytelling are oftentimes more interesting than when the story is just spoon-fed to you. Not everything needs to have an elaborate storyline to tell a good story. Sometimes I just need to know that Ganondorf is back and I have to kick his ass once again. To summarize all of this complaining, while good graphics and an engaging, well-thought-out story can give the appearance of a quality game, ultimately we have to ask ourselves if it really improves the game by a large measure. Does being able to see every bead of sweat on Joel's face or having fully modeled horse balls for Red Dead 2 really improve the gameplay? Does this wonderful world that you've built, chock full of lore, act as a wonderful setup for the game or nice garnish on top? Or does it constrict the gameplay for the sake of the narrative? All of these bells and whistles don't really matter if the game is so boring or overbearing that nobody finishes enough of it to see them. So as we've discussed, newer games are constantly focusing on adding more features, more impressive graphics, more bloat. And all of this fluff can get in the way of what makes games fun in the first place, the gameplay. So in this section I'm going to talk about why I think sometimes more simple game design is better, a less is more approach if you will. When I talk about simple games, my mind instantly thinks of PS2 and GameCube era games, both because I grew up with these and because I think this era of video games really embodies what I'm talking about when I think of simple game design. A lot of these games around this time were straightforward, dumb fun that you can pick up and get right into the action, and in some cases beat in an afternoon. Most of them were quickly developed with about the average budget of a trip to Five Guys. Games around this time often took the approach of throwing a bunch of random shit at a wall and seeing what sticks. But because of the comparatively low budget and quick turnaround time for many of these games, they were able to put out so many different kinds of crazy off-the-wall concepts for games that we just don't get anymore. A stark contrast to AAA games nowadays, which all basically try and do the same thing. This lack of creativity, I think, contributes to the lack of magic that a lot of new games have. They're afraid to do anything new or different anymore, because these generic cinematic games appeal so widely to people and generally sell pretty well. But because of that, I think we've lost something special here. Sure, we've polished these games to look great, but we've also polished off all the fun jank that comes along with it. Many of these games try to be creative and unique by adding in random gameplay segments separate from the main game just to shake up the experience and give players more stuff to do or add replay value. Jak 2, for instance, has a lot of different gameplay segments. In one part of the game you're doing a hoverboard bombing run, in another it's an on-rails first-person shooter, and sometimes there's a racing segment. The Sonic Adventure series had the Chow Gardens, which I can't be the only one to spend almost more time in those than I did in the main game trying to figure out all the fun obscure mechanics and win all the contests in. And I'd be doing the game great disservice if I didn't talk about the absolutely peak minigame collection for Super Monkey Ball 2. These were almost all fantastic, each putting a neat spin on the already great gameplay. None of them were necessary, but they added some bonus stuff to do either alone or with your friends. Not every oddball gameplay segment added to these games were fantastic, but I wouldn't consider these bloat, as oftentimes they weren't necessary for progression and just existed for a little bit of extra stuff to do aside from the main game. Another casualty of having massively overproduced games, in my opinion, is the decline of more simple styles of video games, mainly platformers and collectathons as a genre. Aside from Mario and the surprise Game of the Year winner Astrobot, we don't get a lot of these kinds of games anymore. But back in the early 2000s, they were huge, and we got such a wide variety of them. Abe Escape, Attack and the Power of Juju, Psychonauts, Jak and Daxter. All of these games had a simple get from point A to point B and collect stuff along the way concept, and shared some similar mechanics, but they all tried to put their own gimmicky spin on the genre and were good in their own way. Even the more obscure ones that I remember from my childhood, like the Pac-Man 3D platformer and the Ed, Edd and Eddy video game, were extremely fun in their own way. But the one I wanted to talk about here though has to be the GOAT, SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom. SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom was one of about 1 million random license games that we got around this time, but was among one of the best platformers of the time and is still so fondly remembered, in fact, that we got a remake a couple years ago. Was that because of the good graphics or story? Absolutely not. Mrs. Puff looks like she's on some of the hardest drugs known to man, and Dollar Store Mr. Krabs' voice acting isn't winning any award.
No money means no more Krusty Krabs.
As far as the story goes, all I need to know is that robots are taking over Bikini Bottom, and I need to stop them by collecting spatulas for some reason. But the gameplay was so simple and fun, and the maps and hub area were all fun to explore, and sometimes a game doesn't need to be anything more than that in order to be remembered as a good experience. A lot of these third-party licensed games were like that and had an odd charm in a way. You could tell they weren't trying to be anything super impressive or impactful, but they were fun enough to blow a weekend on, and that's what mattered. Simpsons Hit and Run was kind of a GTA ripoff, but it was also just dumb fun. I put so many hours into playing this and exploring the map and unlocking all the cars and outfits, it's ridiculous. Same with Star Wars Battlefront 2. I can't even track the amount of hours that me and my friends spent on the multiplayer in this one. Hell, even the Shrek Smash Bros. Game had its moments. I think. Actually, maybe not. It was the Wild West of game design, and while not all of them were winners, the devs weren't afraid to get a little goofy with it. A choice that I respect a lot, and I wish that I saw more often nowadays. If you can think of it, there's probably a game about it. A personal favorite of mine that I plan on doing a video on in the future was this basic-ass kaiju beat-em-up where the whole aesthetic was based around classic monster movies, and you just duked it out in these cityscapes as a giant gorilla or praying mantis or whatever. Was it the best beat-em-up out there? No, but I loved it anyway because it was unique and the gameplay was fun and replayable. Basically, what I'm saying is that games don't always need a profound message or story, or even to look the greatest to be fun. And I think these kinds of simple, dumb, fun style of games embody that idea perfectly. Most of the time they focus strictly on the gameplay and making it fun so that you wanted to go back and replay it. Sure, it might have only been an 8-hour game, but if that made the player want to go back and complete it a few times, I think that says more than a 60-hour game that I couldn't even be bothered to finish. So are all new games that come out shiny but soulless turds? No, we still see tons of creativity, but it's almost always seen in indie games. Indie games in some way are a lot like the dumb fun games of old. They embrace being unique in terms of their art style or gameplay mechanics, and for that reason I find that they're so much more interesting than most AAA games that come out anymore. Many of the most interesting games that I played in the last few years were indie games that I love due to having some kind of unique gameplay concept, or taking existing things that we've seen and putting a new spin on them, or just trying crazy combinations of gameplay mechanics. They're willing to take risks in order to stand out and make something fun or unique for the player. And I don't want it to sound like I hate all AAA games, because there's some that I genuinely really enjoyed. The new Doom games were a ton of fun, and I really enjoyed Elden Ring and all the Resident Evils we've been getting, but those mostly focused on being fun games first. At the end of the day, games are meant to be fun, but somewhere along the way we got caught up in making them these massive, hyper-realistic, thought-provoking spectacles instead of making them good games first. And while those things can be great, it shouldn't come at a cost of making them lack things that make them unique and fun. It's my hope that we get more big studios willing to make some out there goofy ideas and take risks, because that's how we get some of the most memorable experiences that'll stick with players years after. It's been shown that time and time again you can do a lot with a little, so in some cases, simple is actually better. I've been Meaty, thank you for watching my video, roll the outro. Hi there, thank you so much for watching until the end of the video. If you liked it, leaving a like and subscribing helps me out a ton, and I'd appreciate that a lot. I'd also like to hear your thoughts. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Do you have a favorite simple game? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see more of my content, I'll have a playlist in the description along with my socials if you want to check out any of that. Second channel, Discord, Twitter, etc. If you really like my content, you want to support me and what I do here, there's a Patreon link too where you can get your name in the credits here, as well as early access to my videos and periodic input on video ideas. But no pressure. I'm just happy that you decided to watch this silly video. Speaking of patrons, a huge thank you to NDH for your Patreon support. You help me continue to make these silly videos, and I appreciate that a lot. Thank you all once again for watching. Have a good one, and I will see you next time.